My name is Alyssa Mitchell. I work for the Utah Office of Substance Use and Mental Health with the Department of Health and Human Services. I've worked in suicide prevention for, 9 years now, almost a decade. And I was asked today to just come and talk um, on a topic about suicide prevention, which is extremely exciting and appropriate as it is September, which is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. Today I'm going to cover some information on how important it is um, how important it is, one, to talk about suicide, but do so in a safe manner so that instead of people feeling hopeless or scared, or triggering someone who might be having thoughts of suicide, to a message that's more hopeful in nature. Um, as I go through the presentation, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat, but I will go ahead and get started for the sake of time. So the presentation is called Safe and Effective Suicide Prevention Messaging, but what exactly do I mean by all that? When we talk about safe messaging, we're talking about communicating about suicide in a manner that is proven to reduce risk for vulnerable individuals already at risk for suicide and increase knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors that are protective from suicide in all community members. And not only in what we say, which is important as well, but also in the images and type of messaging overall that we use, whether that's having a conversation with someone we're concerned about, whether that's in your business as you're communicating with colleagues about a crisis that has occurred, or if you're just wanting to provide more resources. Safe messaging basically means what we say and how we say it can affect somebody's mental health and well-being, and can either encourage people to go seek support or could possibly keep perpetuating the stigma that surrounds suicide, which prevents people from talking about it. So when we talk about suicide as a whole and mental health, there's two audiences or two types of people that you could be talking to. One is a person or an audience that could be at risk for suicide, or be talking at people who are around people who are at risk. The other factor or type of people that generally we'll be communicating to are people who are wanting more information to be able to help somebody, and for us to be able to provide hope and resources for a group. So when we message to individuals, we want to be aware that we don't want to increase the risk among vulnerable individuals. We don't want to use triggering language or images that can upset or trigger an audience member. What we want to do is increase hope and resiliency and encourage people to take action if they are having thoughts of suicide themselves, or if they know someone who is, having them take action to find resources that are available to that person. And it's proven to show that messaging does matter. More than 100 studies have shown that certain types of news coverage, phrases, words that we use can increase the likelihood of suicide. Some of this can be traced back to how long it's discussed for. So how prominent is it in the news, in the media, in our workplace? How often are we being fed this information? What's the type of information that we're receiving as a whole? And from those studies, what we have done is we've looked at what makes a message safe. We want to have a strategy when communicating about suicide so that we, again, do no harm and encourage help seeking. Up here, we have the framework for successful messaging. We have the strategy, which is the outer blue bubble with the arrow showing that this is a constant wheel. This is a constant process to make sure our strategy is good and being implemented on a regular basis. And then we have three components in the center of it. First is a positive narrative. And what we mean by positive narrative is you providing information and resources showing that hope and recovery is a possibility. In the past, you've likely seen messages about suicide and mental health that tends to be more alarming, tends to come from a place of fear. But if we focus on the positive, more positive narrative that while people may have thoughts of suicide, there's hope and resources for them, we're going to be able to engage a wider audience and channel them to the resources that they need. The purple section right here, safety, we want to avoid content that is unsafe or undermines prevention. And we'll talk about what messages are unsafe here in a minute. And then lastly, either just your personal guidelines or as an organization, we want to have rules that we can follow or a step-by-step how-to should a tragedy ever occur. How are we going to talk about this? How are we going to encourage help seeking? And for those who are struggling, how are we going to get them to the resources that they need? So messages that are unsafe. A couple examples we have up here on the screen. And when we mean unsafe, these are strategies that we don't want to incorporate when talking about suicide or mental health. We don't want repeated, prominent, or sensationalized coverage. So, if a story is being shared by the media once an hour, that's considered repeated and prominent coverage. Or let's say you're in an office setting and your coworkers and colleagues are constantly talking about either an individual who's struggling with suicide or an incident that occurred in the workplace, that could be considered prominent coverage as well. We want to be able to talk about it for sure and be able to share hopeful messages, but we want to make sure that it's done so in a responsible educational manner, not just spreading gossip. Messages that are unsafe will include details about the suicide method or location. This is extremely triggering for those who may be having thoughts of suicide, and we don't always know by looking at someone if they're having thoughts of suicide. For people who are having these thoughts of suicide, if we provide the method or the location where a death occurred, it could be very triggering and possibly lead to I don't know if copycat's the right word, but duplicating the same method or duplicating the way the suicide is completed could happen. We never want to glamorize or romanticize suicide. And what we mean by that is when we talk about glamorizing or romanticizing, we never want to make it seem like this was a logical reason why somebody came to this conclusion. We don't want to say, well, this person was justified doing that for X, Y, or Z reasons. What tends to happen when suicide is glamorized or romanticized is blame. People start playing the blame game, and it could lead to, instead of people seeking help, if they need the help, it could lead to blame and further distress by people who are having thoughts of suicide. Suicide is a very complex issue. So when talking about suicide, we don't want to present it as a simplistic reason. There are definitely things that we can see that are going on. So for example, you can see if somebody's struggling by being bullied, or if they're going through some life crises. What we may not see underneath is that on top of those issues, there's some underlying mental health issues. And again, we don't want to ever present it as simplistic because we don't want to assign blame to any one particular person or reason, because there's usually more than one reason, usually more than one explanation for what's going on. We don't want to include personal details that encourage identification with the person who died. So should a death by suicide occur, if people are asking, or if the community is asking for some details to be kept private, we want to respect that. And in fact, before um, talking with anybody or sharing information like this, it's appropriate and encouraged to have a conversation with the immediately affected individuals or family members. We also never want to perpetuate or continue the negative stereotypes of people with mental illness that reinforce stigma. I mean, the reality is that mental health, thoughts of suicide, is like any other ailment that a person may have. It is physically draining on a person, and if we shame people for having a mental illness or struggling, they're not going to go seek help. They are going to hide, they are not going to communicate, and they are going to be stuck in that cycle of despair. But if we encourage help seeking by saying, oh, people, this is a great resource, here's a place where you can go, let me know if you need help, if we provide that support, we're going to have the exact opposite effect. So one story that was predominantly covered in the media was actor Robin Williams' death by suicide. This happened, oh my goodness, about 10 years ago. And what data showed us was that after the death of Robin Williams, there was a 50% increase in calls to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And it used to be the 1-800 number. A good reason for the increase in calls is that when they were sharing the story in the news, and it wasn't a perfect message by any means, but they were sharing that 1-800 number at the time for people to call if they were struggling. Now, on the other side of that, because it was so prominent in the news, it was talked about so often, and there were articles that shared the means and tried to decide singular blame, we did still see a 10% increase in the number of suicides in the US. We saw that men ages 30 to 44 increased by 13%, and as you can see, the same method increased by 32%. So what we learned from this experience is that, as good as it was to provide that hotline number to people, and as beneficial as it was to send that, there is still more work to be done with how we talk and share about suicide in a manner that can protect people instead of putting them at risk. So if we could go back in time, if we could fix the reporting that was done around that, and a lot of prominent media stations and corporations now have gone away from sharing the means and methods, like we would go and take that out of the messaging that occurred at this time. All right, for the sake of time, I will skip that. When having conversations about suicide as a whole, we don't ever want to use phrases like successful suicide, completed suicide. We don't want people who attempt suicide and then survive their attempt. If we say somebody had, a failed attempt, that's going to be very negative to someone's overall mental health and well-being, more so than it was before. And we don't want to, on the other hand, say success or completed, because that sounds like something good that happened. So when we talk about suicide and mental health, as much as possible, we want to keep our language plain. And so using phrases like took his or her own life, died as a result of a self-inflicted injury, died by suicide. That's why that type of messaging is much safer, because we're not assigning a rewards-based system to it. We're not shaming the person. Like this one here at the bottom where we say committed suicide. We're not shaming the person for attempting suicide. If we use the language here on the right, we're speaking plainly about what happened, and then we can communicate resources more effectively to the people who need them. So messages that do help: suicide is preventable. You can share safe lived experiences from those who overcame suicidal crisis, and we have resources for some of those stories on our website, including if you talk about this either just between people or if you share information through your organization, including warning signs and resources of where to go. Oops, wrong way. Is beneficial. Sorry about that. I went the wrong way there for a second. I apologize. And then encourage people to ask, if they see any of these warning signs, to talk to the person and see if they're having thoughts of suicide, and being able to refer people on to resources. Messages that help also highlight how seeking help is a sign of strength. And again, we don't want suicide to be viewed as a logical outcome to adversity. Other great messages are treatment works, you are not alone, and that most people with thoughts of suicide can recover and go on to live healthy lives, and will go seek treatment. We are at time. So what I hope you guys take away from the presentation and the information that I gave to you guys today, and I will share a copy of this presentation with you guys, is to be able to have a safe conversation about suicide, to go find resources where you can. If you have any other, want to learn more about suicide prevention, you're welcome to visit our Live On playbook. But now I will take questions from anybody who may have it.